This is the Tamron 28-75 f2.8. But you're probably already familiar with that. It was launched back in 2018, and this quickly became one of, if not the biggest selling lens for Sony E-mount. Hundreds of people, including myself, have reviewed it and raved about how good it is as a standard zoom with a constant f2.8 aperture, especially given the price point. I've owned this myself for over 3 years, and it's taken me this long to work out that this lens is actually a lie, because it shouldn't be a constant f2.8 aperture. And I don't mean the t-stop values are off or anything. I mean this lens is actually rigged to be a constant f2.8 rather than its true potential as a variable f2 to f2.8. Sounds insane, but seriously, hear me out. I was filming some stuff for a video that I have coming in a few weeks about a misconception of how variable aperture lenses work, and I wanted some comparison shots of a constant aperture zoom versus a variable aperture when they were both zooming to show how the relative entrance pupil sizes change. And the Tamron is the only constant aperture zoom lens that I own. So I went to do a shot looking down the lens whilst it was on the camera and zooming from 28mm all the way out to 75. And this was where I noticed something peculiar, because there appeared to be part of the aperture mechanism that was visible at 28mm that then disappeared as I zoomed in, and then it reappeared as I brought the lens back to 28mm. Odd. Now the lens was definitely at 2.8. I even put a tape measure on it just to be sure, and at 28mm focal length, there is a 10mm entrance pupil between the aperture mechanism, which equals a 2.8 aperture ratio, so it's not a fault there. Instead, it seems like the lens was intentionally powering the aperture mechanism whilst the lens was zooming, so I decided to put it to the test with the lens powered down. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Sony cameras, when you switch the camera off, it automatically stops the lens down to its smallest aperture. I suspect this is linked in some way to it protecting the sensor from being exposed to like really intense light or something, because most Sony cameras don't have the shutter curtain come down when the camera's powered down. But either way, the lens is closed down to their minimum aperture, and the only way to have the lens detached from the camera with the aperture wider than minimum is to take the lens off the camera before you power the camera down. So I set this at 28mm f2.8 and then detached it from the camera and then zoomed the lens to 75mm, and the aperture never disappeared like it did when it was on the camera. The aperture remained visible the entire time. I then put the lens back on the camera, still at 75mm, and powered the camera back up, and the aperture fully opened. Then, keeping the lens at 75mm f2.8, I detached the lens again, and then zoomed it to 28mm, and incredibly, the aperture blades never came into view. I then reconnected the lens to the camera, and bam, aperture blades come straight back and cut the entrance pupil down in size. Mind blown. The maximum physical size of the barrel opening at 28mm here is actually closer to 14mm, not 10. That makes this almost f2 at 28mm. f2. The only reason that this is f2.8 at 28mm is because the lens is programmed to pull the aperture mechanism down on the wide end to make it expose at f2.8. And then it gradually opens it up as the focal length changes in order to keep the exposure at f2.8. I even tested it with some test shots. Detach the lens with the aperture gone, then take a test shot at 28mm with the lens just held up to the camera. Then click the lens into place so it brought the aperture down, and took another test shot, and it's clearly darker with the lens attached. I mean, in reality, you can't use the lens in this setup because this lens is focused by wire, so it's no mechanical linkages. So the lens needs power to drive the focus motor, but you need to attach the lens to the camera in order to get power, and the moment you do that, it stops the aperture down. And you can't accurately pre-focus your shots, as the only way to get this to shoot at f2 is by having the lens at 75mm when you detach it. So even if you pre-focus the lens at 75mm, your focus goes way off because you're then changing the focal length. Now, with some trial and error, I did manage to get some sort of usable results by pre-focusing at 75mm on closer subjects and then detaching the lens and shooting at 28mm for further away subjects. And I have to say, the image quality looks pretty damn impressive. Sure, it lacks a little contrast and there's hints of colour fringing here and there, but the sharpness, especially in the centre of the frame, looks just as good as f2.8. But the fact is, this lens appears to have the potential of actually being a variable f2 to f2.8 zoom, but Tamron seem to have programmed the lens firmware so that it removes that option for us and makes it a constant f2.8. So unless someone can figure out a way to flash the lens firmware in this to remove that option, then we're stuck with this lens not actually being able to reach its true potential. And I think that's sad, because I can't actually figure out why Tamron have done it. I guess we will never know, and I have no idea whether this applies to the newer G2 version or only the Mark 1, because I've never used the G2 and it has a completely different optical design. Although, if anyone does own the G2 lens, maybe you could take a look and let us know down below. But that is it for this video. If you liked it, then please consider liking and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already done so, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video.